Thank you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We're coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email him directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. Right, there's just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services to federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do offer advertising in our newsletter, so you can reach out to this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Michael Gallo, and he's going to be covering proposal cost volume best practices. Thank you for joining us today, Michael, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mallory. Before we get started, just a quick note for this presentation today that I might use the term cost volume, pricing volume, cost and pricing volume. All those terms mean the same thing today for purposes of this presentation. So let's talk today about proposal cost volume best practices. Next slide. So before we get to best practices, let's start with just a basic comparison. Because the cost volume in a proposal is really a separate animal when you compare that to the technical volume. The cost volume purpose is not to sell. Its purpose is to help the government understand how you developed your price and prove to them that you've developed what I would call a Goldilocks pricing. So it's not too high, meaning you have a reasonable price, and that your price is not too low, meaning that it's a realistic price. Cost volumes don't get graded on an A, B, C, D, F. You don't get low, high, medium. You're either compliant and you've demonstrated your pricing is reasonable and realistic, or you haven't. Unlike the other volumes, like the technical volume, where you are scored, and the basis of that score forms the opinion for the contracting officer in terms of trying to make a best value consideration. The other big thing is usually you don't have a single cost volume. Where you have one technical volume, one management, one past performance, you have multiple cost volumes. And the reason why you have multiple cost volumes is because on larger solicitations, there are subcontractor pricing, and the government requires, in many cases, the subcontractors submit separate cost volumes to explain how the subcontractors arrived at their costs and pricing. And this is usually spelled out as a requirement in the RFPs. And finally, I guess an important distinguishing is the cost volume is one of the last documents that you end up putting together completely, because it's last in the process. You can't really document your pricing until you finish your solution and you quantified that and convert it into a pricing. So typically the cost volume is the last document to produce. So with that in mind, let's explore some best practices to help you produce a compliant, a complete, and a reasonable and realistic cost volume. Next slide. So the first best practice is what I regard as the most important. Start early before the final RFP drops and make sure there's follow through afterwards. In most cases, the government agencies reuse content from similar or prior solicitations. You can and should review solicitations from the incumbent contracts if you're bidding on a recompete to get an idea of the kinds of data and information that particular contracting agency might request on the next solicitation. And use this information to start gathering the preliminary data that you're going to need for the cost volume, and also to use that as an opportunity to start issuing initial data calls to your subcontractors for key information that's going to be needed from them. You can't fully complete the cost volume narrative until you've locked down on price. So starting early in the pricing process also helps you to converge on your final price sooner. And I would add that part of your cost volume narrative must address the prime's documented evaluation of your subcontractor's proposed pricing. If your pricing's still in flux, because you don't know what to do, that typically means the subcontractor's pricing is also going to remain in flux and will delay both the completion of the subcontractor's pricing volume and ultimately your evaluation of the subcontractor's pricing volume. And that's not a good situation to be in. Make sure you're reserving time in your schedule to review the subcontractor volumes, just like you're going to have bugs and errors in your own submission. There's probably going to be bugs and errors in the subcontractors' pricing volume. Leave yourself some time to review those, because the subcontractors probably are not going to get it right on the first try. And finally, make sure there's some follow through. Win or lose, make sure you get a debrief and find out if the government made a probable cost adjustment to your proposal, and try and find out why they did. And if the government adjusted your price, it typically means there's something that wasn't either provided, or enough of it wasn't provided in your cost volume, and therefore failed to convince the government that your price was realistic, so they adjusted your estimate. You can feed all this information back into your proposal processes to ensure that you do a better job on the next bid. Next slide, please. So next best practice should be an obvious one. Read and digest and dissect the RFP thoroughly. We all know Section L is the first and most important section to review to understand how to prepare a proposal, but it's not the last section, and especially true for the cost volume. Go back through the rest of the RFP sections and fill in any additional pieces of required information, instructions, or guidance that might be buried in those other RFP sections that will influence how you prepare both the pricing and the pricing narrative. So here's some examples. In the Section B with CLIN pricing, sometimes you're required to actually go ahead and populate the CLIN B pricing schedule and include it in the pricing volume. Make sure you understand that. The statement of work in Section C sometimes provides additional guidance on and direction on things like labor staffing, for example, key personnel. Make sure those are also adequately addressed in your cost narrative. Section H and Section I are your contract clauses, especially in Section H, sometimes there's restrictive clauses in there that affect pricing and ultimately your pricing narrative. So those things might be things like caps on the amount of salary escalation you can apply on your labor, or caps on indirect rates are two common examples. In Section J, it's a list of all your attachments. You need to make sure there isn't any special pricing in specific exhibits that the government has provided in Section A that you're required to fill out and ultimately include in your cost volume. And then finally, obviously, Section M with your evaluation criteria, you want to read that carefully to understand what is evaluated in the pricing. Sometimes it's not clear. And how that price is evaluated. The term total evaluated price talks about the sum. Sometimes it's a comprehensive definition of pricing elements, and sometimes it's a restricted definition of pricing elements. Make sure you understand what total evaluated price means, and also understand whether or not obviously you're involved in a best value type competition or a technically acceptable lowest price type competition. Next slide. So next slide's on compliance matrix. I'm going to preface this particular best practice by saying you, the cost volume lead, should not rely on the proposal manager to create what I'm about to discuss. This particular matrix, which is common tool used throughout the proposal development, but the cost volume compliance matrix needs to be your responsibility as the cost volume lead. And you want to create a comprehensive matrix. The cost volume matrix should track each requirement in the RFP to the location in the cost volume document where the cost that requirement is addressed. The matrix is organized as a table where the table row represents one or more requirements within a specific section of the RFP, and the table columns represent data fields. On the slide here on the right, I prepared a table and provided some recommended data fields that should be included in your compliance matrix. First, track with instructions also apply so that they also apply to your cost volumes. This is an important feature of this table. By tracking what's required from the subcontractors, this will help you develop tailored instructions to your subcontractors who are also subject to many of the same RFP requirements. The second key feature of this table would be to track specific pieces of data and information needed for a given cost volume section. I would also put the point of contact so that you can quickly assess the status of the cost volume's content progress as this process moves along. And by tracking the point of contact, you should be clear you need to know who needs to be reached out to get that data later on when things start falling behind schedule. This tool, when filled out properly, will make you best friends with the proposal manager, who's also concerned about the progress you're making on this key document. And by tracking the data that's necessary to fill this in, your proposal manager will help you if and when the time comes to get the information that you're still lacking for your cost volume. I can't stress enough the importance of putting together this detailed matrix. Cost volumes usually have a lot more RFP proposal instructions than the other volumes. So putting this detailed matrix together is important. And when done properly, it becomes the key blueprint and tool to both organize and track the cost volume, content, and data. Let's move on to the next best practice, please. So annotated cost volume template. As you've built your compliance matrix, now you want to use that information to create a well-organized annotated cost volume template. And let me tell you what that means. It's an annotated template contains the major sections and subsections of your cost volume narrative, along with the guidance, instructions, and samples of the kind of content that's needed for that particular section in the cost volume document. And the reason why we want to do this is you don't want to have your content authors go searching through the RFP to understand what's required in these sections. You want to paste that information directly into these annotated outlines, and you want to include sample tabular summaries and displays relevant in those relevant sections so they understand what information is that you're looking for. And here's the other key point. While you're building out the outline and guidance, add in specific guidance for your subcontractors where it's relevant. And to include also sections that in the outline that aren't applicable or required for the subcontractors. And here's why you want to take that extra step. There's some subset then of this outline that's relevant to your subcontractors who are also required to submit a cost volume. So by taking the time to build this annotated template with the additional subcontractor guidance, you'll have a consistent set of guidance and instructions to give to your subcontractors. You'll decrease the time it takes for them to prepare their cost volume, and you'll get a better proposal deliverable back from them that's consistent, compliant, and complete. So let's talk about some terminology on the next slide. So while we're writing our cost volume narrative, let's make sure as a best practice that we understand some key terms as I listed here on this slide. We already talked about the terms unreasonable and unrealistic at the beginning of this presentation relating to whether your cost and pricing is either too high or too low. I want to talk about the first and last bullets on this slide. And the first item is really important. Too often contractors don't provide backup information when the RFP requests it, and they run the risk of either getting their price adjusted upwards, which is bad enough, or worse, the information isn't provided and the proposal is outright thrown out for non-compliance with RFP instructions. So when the instructions tell offerors to justify, demonstrate, etc., they are looking for more than your assertions. They are telling you that in your cost volume, you need to back it up with some sort of data. So for an example, if the RFP instructions tell offerors to demonstrate that their price is reasonable and realistic, you should provide information that helps the government perform a comparison. So in this example, where I have to demonstrate my price is reasonable and realistic, I would want to pull pricing from relevant past performance contracts and provide that information in my cost volume narrative and use that as a basis of comparison against my proposed price. So ideally, you have 3 past performance projects, let's say, and you form a range, from low to high, low price to high price. And then you document in your narrative that your price, in fact, falls within that low to high range. Now, by writing all this down in your cost narrative, you've demonstrated that your price is both reasonable and realistic because it fell within a range of historical past performance projects that you've performed. So your price is neither too low or too high. On some solicitations, the RFP will say the government wants to ensure there's no unbalanced pricing. And unbalanced pricing means that when you looked at the price as a whole, it looks reasonable, but when you look at its individual parts, like a contract line item, it appears to be unusually high or low. Your cost volume narrative can provide important information to help the government understand what's going on with your pricing. So for example, if the unit price of the first CLIN, the contract line item, is much higher than the second CLIN, which is for the exact same thing, let's say it's for the second quantity, second item, and the second CLIN has a much different price, it might be due to the fact that the first CLIN, that higher price CLIN, has fixed non-recurring costs that have been included in its price and are charged to the first line item, but those costs aren't charged in the second line item. Your cost volume narrative can help evaluators understand what's going on with your pricing so that they understand the behavior of your pricing and don't accuse your pricing of being unbalanced, which is what we're after. So I want to wrap up this presentation with some final thoughts and suggestions on the next slide. So final best practice, I would say, is don't assume familiarity. You must build your cost volume under the assumption that a stranger who is not familiar with your company will be reviewing your cost volume. And I know this for a fact because I am, in fact, one of those strangers that's been hired by the government as a support contractor to help the contracting officer evaluate your cost volume. And I can assure you, I don't know your company, I don't know your prior history, I don't know your accounting system and policies. Make sure your narrative is written clearly so that if I evaluate your cost volume and your cost proposal, I understand your proposed price and how you develop that price. And when your pricers say don't make any more changes to the price, they really mean it. Cost volumes are table intensive, and last minute pricing updates ripple through the entire document and leave it prone to accuracy and consistency errors. And this is doubly true if your pricing and decisions are holding up your subcontractor pricing and your subcontractor's cost volume narrative. So bad things can happen when prices don't match across documents. To sum it up, if you're not going to win the contract on the strength of your cost volume narrative, but you can absolutely lose the contract award if your cost volume narrative is inadequate or non-compliant. I want to thank you today for attending today's webinar. Mallory, back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Mike. If you have any questions for him, you can reach out to him at the phone number or email shown on your screen. And this concludes the webinar.